Picture this. It's 1968, and one of the most advanced machines ever entered in a gas-class drag race rolls into Indianapolis. It never turns a single wheel. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the weird, banned, forgotten machines that quietly bent the rules of drag racing. If you're someone who loves motorsport history and the engineering stories almost nobody tells anymore, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Okay, so here's the thing. When most people picture a gasser, they picture a tall, nose-up little coupe with a blower poking through the hood, screaming down a quarter-mile on pump gas. And that image is right. But the car I want to talk about today wore that exact costume, and underneath it was something completely different. Something that, by the rulebook, had absolutely no business calling itself a gasser at all. The car was called the F Troop, a 1933 Willys coupe, painted green, named after a goofy TV sitcom about bumbling cavalry soldiers. And the two men behind it, Tom Prock and Jay Howell, drove it all the way to Indianapolis Raceway Park for an NHRA event, fully expecting to compete. They had played everything inside the lines. The body looked correct. The fuel was gasoline, exactly what the G in gas class demanded. On paper they had checked the boxes, except for one enormous detail that ended their day before it started. The NHRA tech inspector walked up, took one look at the frame rails, and that was it. Conversation over. Didn't matter what fuel it burned. Didn't matter what the body looked like. The frame wasn't a production-type automobile frame, and under the rulebook that meant it simply was not a gasser. There was nothing to discuss. They had hauled this car across multiple states, and they were going home without making a pass. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so they got disqualified, big deal, that happens. And look, in normal circumstances, that's where the story ends. Most guys in that situation do one of two things. Either they take the car home, strip it down, and build it the legal way. Or they shelf the whole project, eat the loss, and move on to something that actually fits the rules. Prock and Howell did neither. Here's what most people don't realize about that moment. The reason that car got rejected is the exact same reason it would go on to become a legend. Because what these two men had actually built wasn't a gasser with a fancy chassis. It was a full-on funny car wearing a vintage coupe body as a disguise. And when the sanctioning body slammed the door in their face, they didn't argue. They went outlaw. They yanked the Chevy big block out of the nose. They dropped in a Chrysler Hemi. They poured nitromethane into the tank, up to 75%. And they went out looking for a fight. And what happened next produced some of the most spectacular drag racing of the entire late 1960s. This same little 1933 Willys clicking off low 8-second quarter miles at over 185 miles an hour, at a time when the fastest legal gassers in the entire country were stuck running mid-eights on gasoline at their absolute best. We're talking about a car that got thrown out of competition and then proceeded to embarrass the very class that rejected it. But the speed isn't even the most interesting part. This is where it gets really interesting. Because that band Willys didn't just run fast. It launched a family dynasty. A line of racers that runs, unbroken, all the way to the reigning NHRA Funny Car World Champion right now, in 2026. 4 generations. From a 1930 Indianapolis 500 riding mechanic to back-to-back championship. And it all traces back to this one rejected car. So to really get why this thing matters, we have to rewind. We have to understand what drag racing actually was in the mid to late 1960s, and what the gas classes were really about, because without that context the rejection just sounds like bureaucratic nonsense. It wasn't. The inspector was actually right. And understanding why he was right is the whole key to this story. The gas coupe and sedan categories, universally called gassers, started life as a street-based class. The idea was beautifully simple. You take a real street car, with a real production frame and a real steel body, and you modify it within a strict set of rules to go as fast as humanly possible on gasoline. Where you landed was decided by a weight to cubic inch formula. The lighter your car relative to your engine size, the better your class position. And the rules that kept the whole thing honest demanded two things above all else: a production-type ladder frame from an actual automobile, and body panels that at least resembled the car they came from. That second part is why a specific car became the absolute weapon of choice: the 1933 Willys 77 Coupe. And the reason is almost comically practical. The thing weighed basically nothing by American standards, around 2,000 pounds stock, with a short wheelbase and tiny, compact dimensions. A man named Ohio George Montgomery figured this out early, building the first truly competitive Willys gasser back in 1959. And from that point on, the little Willys became synonymous with winning. Stone Woods and Cook ran one. Big John Masmanian ran one. K.S. Pittman ran one. By the mid-60s, if you wanted to win at the top of the gas classes, odds are you were sitting in a 1933 or 1941 Willys. So when Prock and Howell showed up with a Willys body, they weren't being clever. They were following the playbook. The problem was never the body. The problem was everything hiding underneath it. Now, the fuel rule was the part that was absolutely non-negotiable, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because it explains just how far outside the lines these guys eventually went. The fuel was gasoline. Period. That was literally what the G stood for. Nitromethane, that exotic, explosive, eye-watering stuff that was reserved for top fuel dragsters and fuel-altered. Completely separate classes. And here's a detail most people forget entirely. NHRA had banned nitro outright, across the board, from 1957 all the way to 1964, over genuine safety concerns. When they finally brought it back in '64, they fenced it off carefully, restricting it to those designated fuel classes only. So running nitro in a gasser wasn't bending a rule. It wasn't pushing a gray area. It was a different universe entirely. Like showing up to a marathon on a motorcycle. Meanwhile, at the exact same time all of this gasser stuff is happening, something brand new is being born. The funny car. And you need to understand this parallel evolution, because the F Troop ends up sitting right on the fault line between these two worlds. The funny car grew out of the factory experimental altered wheelbase cars that Chrysler and Ford cooked up in 1964 and '65. Machines like the Dodge Coronet and the Plymouth Barracuda, with their axles physically moved forward to shift the weight rearward for better traction. And the class evolved fast. Ferociously fast. By 1967, the defining funny car had become a fiberglass flip-top body draped over a purpose-built tube-frame chassis, running a blown Hemi on nitromethane. A completely different engineering philosophy from a gasser. And critically, the speeds these things were hitting were pushing into territory no gasser could ever dream of touching. Low 8s. And eventually 7s. So picture the landscape. On one side, you've got the gassers, defined by their production frames and pump gas. On the other, you've got funny cars defined by tube chassis and nitro. Two separate species. And Jay Howell looked at that gap between them and thought, what if I build something that lives right in the middle? Now, who was Jay Howell? Because this is a guy who, honestly, should be far more famous than he is. He was born in Detroit in 1942. Orphaned around age 11 when both of his parents died, and raised by his grandparents in Huntington Woods, a suburb just north of the city. He got his first car at 16, found his way into organized drag racing through his brother Jim, and within just a few years he had become one of the most capable fabricators and builders in the entire Detroit scene. And his resume by 1967 is, frankly, ridiculous. He built and drove the original Little Red Wagon. Yeah, that one. The Dodge A100 pickup that became world famous for standing straight up on its rear wheels at exhibitions. Howell was the guy driving it during those first wild wheel stands, including one at Detroit Dragway where he reportedly made a pass at 147 miles an hour while essentially standing on the tailgate. This man was not timid. Let's just establish that right now. He also built the mid-engine Dodge Charger funny car that set both low elapsed time and top speed at the 1965 U.S. Nationals at Indianapolis. 9.02 seconds, 164 miles an hour. He built cars for the Ramchargers, which was Chrysler's own factory-back team. He built Roger Lindamood's Color Me Gone. He built Bill Flynn's Yankee Peddler. Look, when Detroit had a drag racing problem to solve, Jay Howell was one of the very first phone calls anyone made. And in 1967, driving Pete Seaton's Corvair-bodied funny car at Detroit Dragway, he set the speed record there at 179 miles an hour, which made him the first driver to break the 180-mile-an-hour barrier in a funny car. Then, in a move that tells you everything about where his career was headed, he sold his own shop, Automotive Engineering, to Ron and Jean Logghe, and became general manager of Logghe Stamping Company's Competition Products division. And if you know anything about drag racing fabrication in that era, that's like going from running a really good restaurant to suddenly running the single best kitchen in the country. Logghe built the chassis everybody wanted. Tom Prock came to that same destination by a very different road. He grew up on Woodward Avenue, Detroit's legendary cruising strip, racing a Seagas 1939 Pontiac coupe against whoever showed up looking for trouble. He knew Howell from that world. He also knew a guy named Al Bugla, who would later handle the tin work on the Willys. Small community. Tight-knit. The way Detroit's hot rod scene always was. And here's a piece of the backstory that, the more you sit with it, the more it haunts the whole thing. Tom's father, Jimmy Prock Sr., was an Indianapolis 500 riding mechanic. He raced 4 consecutive Indy 500s between 1930 and 1933, alongside a driver named Chet Miller, finishing as high as 10th place in 1931. Jimmy Sr. was also a racer himself who suffered serious injuries in a crash before Tom was even born, and he died when Tom was roughly 14. But here's the thing that gets me. The family kept that racing history a secret. Tom didn't even know what his own father looked like until someone handed him a scrapbook at the funeral. He came to motorsports purely through his own curiosity. No inheritance, no guidance, no family legend pushing him toward it. And when you look at what that family would go on to accomplish, 4 generations, all springing from this one little Willys, you really have to wonder how much of that relentless drive came from a man Tom Prock barely got the chance to know. So by the late 1960s, Prock owned a 1933 Willys. He was campaigning in A-gas supercharged competition, and he'd done reasonably well with it. He brought that car to Jay Howell, looking to take it to the next level. And what Howell proposed wasn't a next level at all. It was a completely different game. Here's what Howell pitched. Instead of modifying the Willys' existing production ladder frame, the way every single legal gasser builder on the planet did it, Howell wanted to design the entire build around a Stage 1 Logghe funny car tubular chassis. A real tube frame. Race purpose construction from the ground up. Shortened and narrowed to tuck neatly beneath that 1933 Willys body. Then they took it further. They got a company called B&N to build a fiberglass reproduction of the Willys body as a one-piece flip-top unit. The entire shell hinged at the front so it could tilt forward to access the engine. Exactly, precisely the way a funny car worked. A single functioning door. A full roll cage integrated right in. Center steering. A 99-inch wheelbase. Al Bugla did the tin work to marry the body to the chassis. They painted it green, bolted in a 427 Chevy with an 871 blower and Hillborn high-profile 4-valve fuel injection, and named it after the TV show. And this is the key detail that explains everything that came after. What they had built was a funny car that looked like a gasser. Not a gasser with a better chassis. Not a production car modified within the spirit of the rules. A purpose-built tube-frame race car wearing a vintage coupe body as a costume. Nobody had ever done this before. It was either a stroke of genius or a complete misread of how NHRA was going to react. Turned out to be both. So they roll into the Indianapolis Regional, and you already know how that goes. The tech inspectors take one look at the chassis and that flip-top body, and the conversation is over. Howell's own recollection of the Rejection was almost comically understated. He said something like, they wouldn't let it run, something about the frame rails not being original, or something like that. Prock's version put more emphasis on the flip-top body being the sticking point. And honestly, both men are probably right, because the car violated the rules on multiple levels simultaneously. The chassis wasn't a production frame. The body wasn't production construction. It was a stack of violations wearing green paint. But here's the thing about that Rejection that the mythology sometimes gets wrong. It wasn't some dramatic, fist-pounding public confrontation. There was no hearing, no appeal, no formal ban letter framed on a wall somewhere. It was just a tech inspector quietly saying no, and that being that. The legend around this car sometimes inflates that moment into a courtroom drama, but it really doesn't need the embellishment. Because the significance of what NHRA's decision actually meant is dramatic enough on its own. By refusing to let this car compete, NHRA was essentially admitting something. They were acknowledging that a full tube-frame race car simply could not be a gasser, no matter what body sat on top of it. And you know what? That was the correct call. Genuinely. The inspector wasn't being a jerk. He was protecting the integrity of a class that was built on production-based hardware. But, and here's the tension at the heart of this whole story, that correct call also meant that the single most advanced gas class car anyone had ever conceived was not allowed to run in the gas class. The rules had been outrun by the engineering. And that gap, that exact gap, is where the entire legend was born. So Prock and Howell ran the car locally through 1968, still with the big block Chevy on gasoline, and then they parked it at Logghe stamping over the winter. Howell described it as stored in the attic at Logghe's, just sitting there. This incredible, banned piece of engineering with absolutely nowhere to go. And then the phone rang. Pete and Bill Hill, the Hill brothers, were running their own 1933 Willys on the East Coast, and they came to Prock and Howell with a proposition. Form a 4-car outlaw touring circuit. Not NHRA. Not AHRA. No sanctioning body at all. Just 4 teams, booking match races at independent tracks, giving fans something they literally could not see anywhere else. The other 2 cars in the package would be an Anglia run by Jim Shore with a partner named Hess, and another Anglia from Chuck Finders. And here's the catch. Or maybe it was the whole point. This circuit would run on nitromethane. The cars would be advertised as fuel coupe. No rulebook telling them what fuel to burn or what chassis to run. Just whoever could lay down the best time slip taking the money home. Pure, distilled competition. Prock and Howell said yes. And then they went to work turning the F Troop into something genuinely terrifying. The 427 Chevy came out. In went a 426 cubic inch Chrysler Hemi. The same engine family running in top fuel dragsters and funny cars at the absolute pinnacle of the sport. Supercharged with the 871 blower, Hillborn injection, and nitromethane up to 75% concentration, which, for that era, was a serious dose. Not quite what the top fuel cars ran, but worlds beyond gasoline, and more than enough to completely transform what the engine was doing. They repainted the car in a wild, rainbow, multicolor scheme. Psychedelic colors that managed to stand out even in the gloriously chaotic visual environment of a 1969 drag strip. Now, you might be wondering, okay, what does 75% nitro in a blown Hemi actually mean in practical terms? Fair question. Here's the answer. A properly built blown nitro Hemi of this era was capable of somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 horsepower, depending on the tune and the fuel percentage. Nobody ever put the F Troop on a dyno, so there's no documented number, but that's the realistic ballpark for a comparable setup. And for context, here's the part that should make your jaw drop. The fastest gasoline-burning AA/GS gassers in all of America, cars already pushing the absolute outer limits of what gasoline could physically do, were making around 500 to 700 horsepower on their very best days. The F Troop came back from winter break with 2 to 3 times that power, and a frame actually designed to handle it. And what it ran out on that outlaw circuit was not subtle. Not even a little. Jay Howell described it as posting consistent low 8s at 185 plus, while pedaling it. And that word, pedaling, is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. Because pedaling means he was lifting off the throttle and reapplying it, over and over, mid-run, just to manage traction. He was not running the thing flat out. He physically couldn't. The car made so much power that he had to hold it back, feathering the gas to keep the rear tires from going up in smoke, and it was still clicking off 8-second passes. Think about that. The car was fast in spite of the driver having to constantly back out of it. The most precisely documented run comes from Dover Dragstrip in Delaware, on August 17, 1969. And here's a little piece of cultural trivia that puts the whole moment in amber. That was the exact same day Woodstock was opening up in Bethel, New York. So while 500,000 people were getting muddy and finding themselves in a field, the F Troop was out terrorizing a drag strip in Delaware. Tells you something about what America was doing with itself that particular weekend. The 4-car circuit ran as fuel coupes that day, and the F Troop put up the quickest pass of the entire event. 8.21 seconds at 180 miles an hour. The Hill brothers ran. Shore and Hess ran. Chuck Finders ran. Nobody touched the Willys. And to really feel how absurd that number was, you have to compare it to the legal world. The AA/GS national record on gasoline that very same year was Ohio George Montgomery, the godfather of the gasser, running 8.56 at 171 in a Mustang body. So the F Troop was running half a second quicker and almost 10 miles an hour faster. On a track with no sanctioning. Against no official competition. Just going out there and doing it for fun and a payout. The band car was beating the record holder's numbers in an exhibition. Howell described the whole circuit as feeling like a traveling circus, and that's about the most accurate phrase you could pick. The 4 cars would book a track, pack up the trailer, drive through the night, and put on a show the next day. Howell, by the way, was the only one in the entire group with a full-time day job. He said getting back to work on Mondays was always a challenge, which is, I think, the understatement of 1969. You spend Sunday wrestling a 185-mile-an-hour Nitro car sideways through the lights, and then Monday you're back at a desk. Sure. But the traveling was one thing. What Howell was dealing with from behind the wheel was a completely different beast. And this is where the engineering story takes a genuinely scary turn. Here's the problem. At speeds approaching 165 miles an hour, that 1933 Willys body, a shape designed in 1933 for people puttering to work at 40 miles an hour, became a serious aerodynamic liability. The upright, slab-sided profile generated real, dangerous rear-end lift at high speed. The faster it went, the more the back of the car wanted to fly. And Howell described some genuinely frightening moments out there. Picture this. You're sideways in the timing lights, the left rear tire is literally off the ground, and you're just waiting, hoping, for the parachute to catch and settle everything back down. The cross-form chute that Bill Simpson supplied saved that car repeatedly. But, look, relying on a parachute to stabilize a 185-mile-an-hour vehicle is not what anyone would call a long-term solution. So the Logghe brothers came up with a fix. And it sounds almost laughably simple now, but for the era it was genuinely clever. They fabricated small wings and bolted them directly to the rear fenders, specifically to push the tail down at speed. Early aerodynamic downforce devices, on a full-body drag car in 1969. Crude compared to what funny cars would develop over the next few years, sure. But functional. And here's where it gets good. When the team debuted these wings on the East Coast, The Hill Brothers group took one look at them and started laughing. They nicknamed them the Mickey Mouse Ears, and they made it very clear they thought the whole setup looked completely ridiculous. Jay Howell's response was to just strap in and make a pass. First run with the wings produced 178 miles an hour. The car was stable. The rear stayed planted. No drama. And the very next week, every single car on that circuit had wings bolted to its fenders. Every single one. The same guys who'd been cackling at the Mickey Mouse Ears were now copying them as fast as they could fabricate them. And that, right there, is drag racing engineering in its purest form. Somebody tries something that looks stupid. It works. Everybody copies it immediately and pretends they never laugh. The circuit ran through all of 1969, hitting tracks across the East Coast and out into the Midwest. Small independent strips, mid-size venues, places that desperately needed a crowd-drawing main event. And a 4-car package of nitro-burning Willys and Anglia coupes running 8-second passes was exactly the kind of show those promoters were starving for. Match racing worked as a business model for one simple reason. Fans showed up to see specific cars and specific matchup. They did not care, even a little, whether some sanctioning body in an office somewhere approved of the chassis underneath. And this matters more than it might seem, because by 1969 the entire economic foundation of drag racing was shifting in ways that would eventually wipe the gasser class off the map completely. The top gas teams were facing a brutal choice: keep racing under increasingly restrictive NHRA rules, in cars that were barely street legal in any honest sense, or jump to funny cars where the real money and the real speed actually lived. Ohio George switched to a Mustang body under pressure from Ford. Big John Mazmanian went funny car. Stone, Woods, and Cook built a Mustang flipper. The era was quietly ending, right under everyone's feet. And what Prock and Howell had done, almost by accident, was build a car that lived in the gap between two dying and emerging worlds. It was too radical for the class it was designed to compete in. And it was too old-fashioned, too vintage-looking, for the funny car class it technically resembled mechanically. So they did the only logical thing. They took it outside both structures entirely, and they found an audience that didn't need a rulebook to appreciate the spectacle of 8-second passes on nitromethane. Now here's the part that's almost poetic. NHRA eliminated the gas classes entirely in 1972. 3 years after the F Troop was running its best times out on that outlaw circuit. So the car that got banned for being too advanced for the class outlived the class itself. Let that sink in. The rulebook rejected the F Troop for being too much. And then the rulebook quietly deleted the entire category a few years later. The car was right. The class was wrong. History just took a minute to catch up. Over the winter of 1969 into 1970, Prock, Howell, and the Logghe brothers sat down and made a decision. The future was funny cars. Plainly, the F Troop had been a bridge. The most radical gasser-bodied car ever built, and simultaneously, not really a gasser at all. They'd taken it as far as it was ever going to go. So they sold the Willys. And they transplanted that Nitro Hemi drivetrain into a brand-new Logghe chassised Mustang funny car, which they named the War Horse. Howell later called selling the F Troop a mistake. And honestly, it's not hard to understand why he felt that way, given what eventually happened to the car. But we'll get to that. The War Horse went out and immediately validated everything they'd learned on the outlaw circuit. At the 1970 NHRA Summer Nationals at Detroit Dragway, racing against absolute legends, Don Prudhomme, Tom McEwen, Gene Snow, the Ramchargers, Howell and Prock won all 3 days of the event. Clean sweep. Drag News ran the headline, Howell all the way at Detroit. They finished 4th in the NHRA National Funny Car standings for the entire season. Not bad. Not bad at all for a first-year, full funny car effort from a team that had just been outlaws a few months earlier. And Don Prudhomme, the snake himself, was impressed enough that he brought Howell in to drive his Mattel Hot Wheels Barracuda at the 1970 U.S. Nationals at Indianapolis. Prudhomme wanted to focus on his top fuel car, so he needed a shoe for the funny car. Howell qualified fifth in the field with a 6.99 second pass, one of the first drivers ever to dip into the 6-second zone in a funny car at a national event. Remember, this is the same guy who broke 181st. The man had a habit of being early to every barrier. There's a detail from that week that Howell apparently never forgot. During the pre-race burnout, Tom Prock accidentally set the bleach box on fire. And the resulting blaze was spectacular enough that the team very nearly got thrown out of the entire event. Which, only at Indianapolis. There's something almost perfect about a team born from getting rejected at Indy, nearly getting ejected from Indy again, this time for an actual fire. Howell retired from driving at the end of 1970. He'd proven everything he ever needed to prove, and he was smart enough to know exactly when to walk away. He worked with the Ramchargers for a few more years, then moved his family north and spent 13 years running a Goodyear tire center in Gaylord, Michigan, before eventually becoming a certified financial planner down in Texas. He and his wife spent years living aboard their sailboat, cruising from Maine to the Bahamas. And honestly, that's a certain kind of life philosophy in action right there. Build some of the fastest, most dangerous cars in the world, and then go sail around being peaceful about it. Tom Prock, though, he kept racing. He drove funny cars for another full decade, mostly the Utica Flash operation out of New York State, where he won over 60% of his races across roughly 6 years. 60%. He reached the Gator Nationals Funny Car Final in 1975, and very nearly won the 1977 U.S. Nationals before red-lighting against Prudhomme in the semifinals. He ran as many as 75 match races a year during that stretch, which gives you a real sense of what the outlaw circuit economy looked like for a genuinely competitive team. Eventually he stopped driving and moved into crew chief work, building cars for Tom McEwen's Corps' Funny Car Corvette effort, winning multiple NHRA national events and an NHRA world title along the way. By the late 1980s, he was working at Vinolia Pistons in Long Beach, and eventually became the general manager. And here's where the story stops being about a car, and starts being about a bloodline. The engine tuning skills that Tom Prock developed setting up the F Troop's Nitro Hemi out on that outlaw circuit in 1969, those skills passed directly to his son, Jimmy Prock. Jimmy started helping his father in the pits at age 11, in 1977. He grew up inside an entire generation of professional nitro racing, soaking it all in, and he eventually became one of the most accomplished crew chiefs in the entire history of NHRA. He tuned Joe Amato to championship. He ran Robert Height's car. He won with John Force Racing year after year after year. People in the sport started calling any car he tuned the Prock Rocket. That's the kind of reputation that doesn't get handed out. You earn it one whole shot at a time. And Jimmy's son? That's Austin Prock. And Austin Prock just won back-to-back NHRA Funny Car World Championships in 2024 and 2025. His brother, Thomas, serves as assistant crew chief right under their father, Jimmy. So you've got grandfather, father, and 2 grandsons, all in the sport at the highest level simultaneously. But here's the moment that gives me chills every time. At the 2024 U.S. Nationals at Indianapolis, the exact same track where the F Troop got turned away at tech inspection 56 years earlier, Austin Prock won the Funny Car Final. And while Austin took that win at Indianapolis, his grandfather, Tom Prock, the man who had been sent home from that very same track 56 years earlier, was watching from somewhere in the grandstands. 4 generations. From a 1930 Indianapolis 500-riding mechanic, to a band Willys, to a 2024 championship on the same asphalt. You could not script that better if you tried. And the story isn't even finished. The late November 2025 departure of Austin, Jimmy, and Thomas Prock from John Force Racing, all together, as a unit, was one of the biggest personnel moves in recent NHRA history. As of early 2026, the entire Prock family has landed at Tosca Racing, running a Ford Mustang Dark Horse in funny car. So the dynasty rolls on. New team, same bloodline, still chasing the same thing Tom was chasing in a green Willys in 1968. But what about the car itself? What happened to the actual F Troop? Well, this is the part that genuinely hurt Jay Howell. After Prock and Howell sold it, the car passed through a string of owners, and at some point it ended up being raced all the way out in Hawaii. How it got there, and under what circumstances, has honestly never been fully documented. It just sort of vanished into the Pacific for a while, and when it eventually came back to the mainland, it had been converted into a basic bracket racing car and repainted plain red. The wild rainbow scheme was gone. That historic flip-top Willys body was just sitting on the tube chassis, looking like nothing it had ever been. When photos of it in that state finally reached Jay Howell, he described seeing them as getting sick to his stomach. He said it had been so hacked up. Imagine building something that beautiful and that significant, and then seeing it butchered into an anonymous red bracket car. That's a tough thing for a builder to look at. But here's where it turns around. A man named Dan Hicks from Lawrence, Kansas, found the car. And get this, he found it at a flea market in Wisconsin. A flea market. One of the most historically important drag cars of the late 60s, sitting at a Midwest flea market under red paint. Hicks recognized exactly what it was underneath all those bracket racing modifications, and he arranged to bring it back from the dead. Then a man named Stephen Timasick of Belleville, Michigan, completed a full, proper restoration in 2006, returning the car to its glorious 1969 Rainbow Nitro circuit configuration, blown Hemi and all. And in 2005, just before the restoration was completely finished, Jay Howell was invited to drive the car in the Cackle Fest parade at the NHRA Hot Rod Reunion in Bowling Green, Kentucky. His first reunion with that car in 35 years. He simply said it was a very nice reunion. After everything, after the rejection, the glory, the sale he regretted, and the heartbreak of seeing it hacked up, he got to sit in it again. That's a good ending right there. At the 2007 Detroit Autorama, the 55th annual show at Cobo Center, the restored F Troop received the Meguiar's Preservation Award from the Michigan Hot Rod Association, given to the best preserved example of a vintage hot rod. Think about the irony of that for a second. The car that was built to be too advanced for its class, the car that got banned for being too much, ended up being formally honored for being beautifully preserved. Timasick even ran it at Norwalk Raceway Park on gasoline, where it clicked off a 9.88, an easy pass just to hear the thing run and cackle. Howell, of course, reportedly kept trying to convince him to put the nitro back in it. Once a hot rodder, always a hot rodder. The car was later offered on eBay in 2008 for around $425,000, and ACME Diecast even produced a limited run of 1/18 scale models in the rainbow scheme. Only 400 pieces, with a variant labeled nitromethane. You'll see them at shows. The people who know exactly what they're looking at stop and stare. So what does it all actually mean? Chad Reynolds, over at Bang Shift, wrote probably the clearest summary of what the F Troop's rejection really signified. He described it as the first gas-class car built on a shortened funny car chassis, and noted that while it got outlawed quickly, it might have marked the beginning of the end for the gas class itself. And you know what? That's not an overstatement at all. When NHRA looked at what Howell built and said no, they were drawing a line that quietly admitted the class they were protecting simply couldn't survive that level of engineering ambition. 3 years later, they stopped trying to protect it. Now, the purists in gasser circles, they still argue about this car to this day. One camp says, look, a tube chassis nitro-burning car is not a gasser, full stop, no matter what body it wears, and it should be remembered as a funny car in disguise, not mentioned in the same breath as Ohio George's legitimate Willys. And the other camp says the history of this car is completely inseparable from gasser history, because it came directly out of that world, and its rejection literally helped shape what happened to that world. And here's the thing. Both camps are right. The F Troop was built by gasser racers to compete in the gasser class, using gasser-style body construction on non-gasser chassis technology. It lived in the space between two eras, and the entire reason it matters is precisely because it sat on that fault line. The car wasn't just too fast for its class. It was a rolling, screaming, physical argument that the class had run its course. Jay Howell passed away on October 23, 2024, at age 82 in Fenton, Michigan. He received the NHRA Lifetime Achievement Award in 2018 and was selected for the International Drag Racing Hall of Fame class of 2025, an announcement that came just before his death. His sons accepted the honor in March of 2025 at Gainesville, with Jack Beckman presenting it. So that's the story. A car built in a Detroit shop, a car that walked into tech inspection wearing a costume and got sent home. A car that came back on Nitro and embarrassed the very class that rejected it, invented downforce nobody believed in, got hacked up, got rescued from a flea market, and launched a dynasty that's still winning today. NHRA banned it at Indianapolis, and 56 years later, the family it created is winning at Indianapolis. There's something deeply satisfying about how that all worked out.